I never expected my small veteran-owned farm to cause such an uproar, but when Pine Valley Estates HOA tried to slap me with a $50,000 fine for agricultural violations on land that wasn't even in their jurisdiction, I knew I had to fight back. Funny how some people think their suburban rules apply to a combat veteran's farmland that isn't even part of their precious homeowners association. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After serving 2 tours in Afghanistan, working the land became my therapy. There's something deeply healing about growing your own food and being self-sufficient. When my wife Sarah and I finally purchased our 5-acre homestead last spring on the outskirts of Maple Grove, I was thrilled to start my small farming operation. The land spoke to me the moment we saw it. After 12 years in the military, I needed a place where I could find peace, and this forgotten piece of farmland on Sterling Road was exactly what I'd been dreaming about during those long nights in the desert. I threw myself into the work with the same dedication I'd given to my military service. Every morning I'd wake up at dawn, just like in the army, but instead of combat drills, I was fixing fences, tilling soil, and building chicken coops. My veteran buddies started dropping by to help out, and soon we had an informal support group meeting over farm work and coffee. It felt like I was finally building something meaningful, something that could help other vets find their way back to civilian life through farming. That's when Marcus Wellington III, the president of Pine Valley Estates HOA, decided to make my farm his personal crusade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this whole mess started and how a bunch of suburban homeowners tried to shut down a veteran's dream of running a small farm. The property had been on the market for over 2 years before we found it. Most buyers were scared away by the overgrown fields, dilapidated barn, and the sheer amount of work needed. But where others saw problems, I saw potential. Sarah initially had concerns about the massive undertaking, but after seeing the sparkle in my eyes during our first visit, she knew this was exactly what I needed for my transition back to civilian life. Our realtor, Jim, was surprisingly honest about the property's challenges. "Look, Mike," he said during our second viewing, "this place needs a ton of work. The soil hasn't been properly maintained in years, the irrigation system is shot, and that barn might need to be torn down completely." He paused, checking my reaction. "But the price reflects all that, and being just outside city limits means you've got agricultural zoning. You could do pretty much whatever you want here." That last part was crucial. We'd looked at other properties closer to town, but the zoning restrictions would have made it impossible to run the kind of operation I envisioned. This property was perfect, just far enough out to have agricultural freedom, but close enough to easily reach farmers' markets and potential customers. The closing process was surprisingly smooth. The elderly owner, Mrs. Peterson, had inherited the land from her late husband, but couldn't maintain it anymore. When she learned I was a veteran planning to turn it into a working farm again, she actually dropped the price a bit more. "Thomas would have loved to see a soldier bring this land back to life," she told me during the final walkthrough, referring to her husband, who'd been a Korean War veteran. The day we got the keys, Sarah and I stood in what would become our front yard, surrounded by waist-high weeds and the distant sound of highway traffic. Our modest savings had gone into the down payment, and we had just enough left for initial improvements. It wasn't much, but it was ours, our little piece of the American dream. I spent that first week just walking the property, making detailed notes and drawings. The land had good bones, gentle slopes for natural drainage, a year-round creek on the north edge, and despite years of neglect, the soil tests came back promising. The previous owners had mainly grown hay, but with proper rehabilitation we could grow just about anything. Our new neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. The families in the few scattered farmhouses nearby would wave as they drove past. Old Bill Johnson, whose property bordered ours to the east, even brought over some homemade apple cider and offered to lend us his tractor until we could get our own. The only potential concern was Pine Valley Estates, the upscale housing development that had sprung up about a quarter-mile west of our property. These weren't your typical suburban homes. We're talking massive houses with perfectly manicured lawns, three-car garages, and what looked like a small army of landscapers maintaining everything. A tall privacy fence marked their eastern boundary, presumably to shield their view of the agricultural zone. Sarah and I didn't think much of them at first. We were technically in different townships, separated by an old county line. Their HOA signs stopped well before our property, and their fancy development seemed like a different world, entirely from our dusty farm roads and working lands. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. The way some of the Pine Valley residents would slow down as they drove past our property, shaking their heads at the old barn. The whispered conversations at the local hardware store about maintaining property values and neighborhood standards. But I was too focused on my plans, too excited about finally having a place to build something meaningful. If I'd known then what was coming, the confrontations, the threats, the absurd demands, maybe I would have done things differently. But then again, maybe not. Some things are worth fighting for, and this wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about a veteran's right to heal through honest work, about the difference between real community values and artificial ones imposed by those who think their way of life is the only right way. Little did I know, my dream of a peaceful farming life was about to collide head-on with suburban politics and HOA overreach in ways I never could have imagined. My vision for the farm was more than just growing crops. It was about creating a healing space for veterans like myself. I'd seen too many of my brothers and sisters struggle with the transition back to civilian life, and I knew firsthand how working the land could help quiet those demons we all brought back from overseas. The plan was to start small but purposeful. Phase 1 would focus on establishing the basics: a large vegetable garden, a modest chicken operation for eggs, and rehabilitating the old apple orchard we discovered hidden behind years of overgrowth. But what really excited me was Phase 2, creating a veterans agricultural training program. I wanted to teach other vets the skills I was learning, show them how farming could provide both purpose and income. I spent countless hours at my kitchen table drawing up detailed plans and schedules. The eastern field would be divided into rotating crop sections: tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, and root vegetables. The western pasture would eventually host free-range chickens, with mobile coops I designed based on military logistics principles. The old barn, once restored, would serve as both a workshop and a gathering space for veteran support meetings. Sarah caught me one night, surrounded by farming books and YouTube tutorials on my laptop. "You're planning this like it's a military operation," she said, smiling as she brought me a cup of coffee. She wasn't wrong. I had contingency plans for different weather scenarios, supply chain spreadsheets for equipment and seeds, and even a detailed SWOT analysis of local farmers. "Markets. Remember what Dr. Martinez said," she continued, referring to my VA counselor. "This is supposed to be healing, not another mission." But that's the thing about us veterans. We function best with a clear objective, a mission to accomplish. And this mission was personal. I'd already connected with several local veteran support groups, and the response was overwhelming. Tom, a former Marine who'd been struggling with PTSD, offered to help with the barn renovation. Jenny, an Army mechanic who served in Iraq, volunteered to maintain our equipment. Even my old platoon sergeant, now retired and living 2 counties over, wanted to be part of what we were building. The local agricultural extension office was incredibly supportive too. When I shared my plans with them, they connected me with grant opportunities specifically for veteran farmers. There were actually federal programs designed to help veterans transition into agriculture, which could help fund some of our bigger projects down the line. Everything was falling into place. I had spreadsheets showing how we'd break even by year. 3. Plans for expanding into farmers' markets across 3 counties, and even preliminary sketches for educational workshops we could offer. The chicken coop would come first. We'd start with 50 heritage breed hens, chosen for both their egg production and their ability to thrive in free-range conditions. The vegetable gardens would be established using permaculture principles, maximizing yield while minimizing water usage. But my favorite part of the plan was the therapy garden. I'd designed a special section near the creek where we'd grow medicinal herbs and flowers. It would be a quiet space where vets could work in peace, surrounded by the gentle sounds of running water and buzzing bees. I remembered how much the garden at the VA hospital had helped me during my roughest days, and I wanted to create something similar here. The orchard restoration would be a longer-term project. We'd discovered 30 ancient apple trees, probably planted decades ago and now almost wild. An arborist confirmed they were heritage varieties, some quite rare. With proper pruning and care, they could produce again. And I loved the symbolism of bringing these old soldiers back to life. Looking back now, I can't help but laugh at how detailed and optimistic those early plans were. Not that they were unrealistic. Most of them would eventually come to fruition, just not in the straight line I'd imagined. I didn't account for the hurricane of suburban politics that was about to hit us, or how defending our right to farm would become a battle almost as challenging as any I'd faced in uniform. But that's the thing about plans. They're just a starting point. Any soldier knows that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And while I never expected to find enemies in our own backyard, those early plans gave us a foundation to build on, a vision worth fighting for. They reminded us what we were working toward when things got tough, when it would have been easier to just give in to the pressure and sell out to the developers who kept circling our land like vultures. Those first few months were pure sweat and determination. Every morning, I'd start before sunrise, just like in the military. There's something serene about watching the dawn break over freshly tilled soil, the mist rising from the creek as the world slowly comes alive. The work was backbreaking, but it was honest, the kind of exhaustion that helps quiet the mind. Sarah and I tackled the cleanup first. Years of neglect had left us with a jungle of overgrowth to clear. We filled dozens of industrial-sized dumpsters with debris from the old barn, discovered rusted farm equipment hidden in the tall grass, and spent weekends pulling out invasive vines that had nearly strangled the apple trees. My veteran buddies would show up on weekends, turning our workdays into informal therapy sessions. The chicken coop was our first major project. I designed it using recycled materials from the barn renovation. Old tin roofing, salvaged lumber, and hardware we'd cleaned up. Tom, the former Marine, turned out to be a skilled carpenter. Better than building fighting positions, he'd joke as we worked. We built the coop on wheels, following Joel Salatin's pastured poultry designs, so we could move it around the property. The chickens would help fertilize the soil while staying safe from predators. The vegetable gardens took shape next. We marked out 2 acres for intensive cultivation, using permaculture principles to maximize efficiency. Jenny, our resident mechanic, got an old tractor running that Mrs. Peterson had left behind. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. We installed drip irrigation systems, built raised beds from reclaimed wood, and started composting everything we could get our hands on. Word spread in the veteran community, and more folks started showing up to help. Mike, a former Army medic, brought his expertise in herbs and started planning our medicinal garden. Lisa, who'd served as a logistics officer, helped organize our tool shed with military precision. Even my old platoon sergeant drove down one weekend with his truck full of fruit tree saplings, a gift from his own orchard. The transformation was dramatic. By the end of the third month, we had the chicken coop up and running with 50 heritage breed hens settling in nicely. The vegetable beds were taking shape, with the first seedlings pushing through the soil. We'd cleared enough of the orchard to identify 30 surviving apple trees, and the arborist confirmed that with proper care, they'd produce fruit again next season. But it wasn't just the land that was transforming. I watched as my fellow vets found purpose in the work. Tom stopped having nightmares after spending days working in the fresh air. Jenny's anxiety attacks became less frequent. There was something about working the land that seemed to help us all heal. We started having informal support group meetings during lunch breaks, sharing stories over sandwiches in the shade of the old oak tree. Sarah set up a small farm stand at the end of our driveway, selling our first eggs and some early vegetables. The response from the local community was overwhelming. People loved the idea of supporting a veteran-owned farm, and our eggs sold out every day. Several local restaurants reached out about buying our produce once we were fully operational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The County Agricultural Extension Office sent out their soil specialist, who confirmed what we'd hoped. Our land had great potential. Years of neglect had actually allowed the soil to recover from previous overfarming. With our organic approach and careful management, we could build something special here. Even the weather seemed to cooperate. We had just enough rain to keep everything growing without flooding, and the unusually mild spring meant we could work longer days. Every evening, Sarah and I would sit on our porch, watching the sunset over our budding farm, feeling like we were finally building something meaningful. But success has a way of drawing attention, and not all of it welcome. As our farm started taking shape, more cars from Pine Valley Estates would drive by slowly, their occupants frowning at our growing operation. We didn't know it then, but our progress was about to collide with suburban sensibilities in a way that would test everything we'd built. Looking back, those first months were like the calm before a storm. We were so focused on the work, on the healing it brought, that we didn't see the gathering clouds. But that's often how it goes. You're too busy building something good to notice those who might want to tear it down. Marcus Wellington III made his grand entrance on a sunny Tuesday morning, driving up our dusty driveway in his spotless Mercedes SUV. I was in the middle of repairing a fence post when I saw him approaching, looking comically out of place in his pressed khakis and polo shirt. The way he wrinkled his nose at the natural farm smells told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. "Good morning," he called out, trying not to step in anything with his polished loafers. "I'm Marcus Wellington III, president of the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association." He said it like he was announcing royalty, adjusting his designer sunglasses as he surveyed our property with obvious distaste. I wiped my hands on my work pants and offered a handshake, which he hesitantly accepted. "Mike Anderson, what can I do for you?" I noticed he quickly wiped his hand with a monogrammed handkerchief after our greeting. "Well, Mr. Anderson, I'm here to discuss some concerns our residents have raised about your—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Operation. Here," he gestured vaguely at our flourishing farm. "We've had numerous complaints about the agricultural activities taking place so close to our development." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Sir, this is a working farm. Agricultural activities are kind of the point." Several of our chickens chose that moment to wander past, pecking at insects in the grass. Marcus visibly recoiled. "Yes, well, that's precisely the issue. Pine Valley Estates maintains certain standards of appearance and lifestyle, Your farm animals and these, he waved dismissively at our vegetable gardens, activities are not in keeping with our community's aesthetic values. I took a deep breath, remembering the anger management techniques I'd learned at the VA. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate your concern, but we're not part of Pine Valley Estates. This is agriculturally zoned land, and we're in a completely different township. His face tightened into what I'd come to know as his authority expression. Actually, Mr. Anderson, our HOA's sphere of influence extends to all properties that might impact our community's value and appearance. Your property is clearly visible from several of our homes. Sarah came out of the house then, probably wondering why a luxury SUV was parked in our driveway. As she approached, I could see Marcus's expression shift. He clearly thought he'd found a more sympathetic audience. Ah, Mrs. Anderson, I presume. He turned on what he probably thought was charm. I was just explaining to your husband about our community standards. Surely you understand our concerns about property values. Sarah, still wearing her gardening gloves and covered in dirt from working in the herb garden, gave him her sweetest smile. Mr. Wellington, I understand completely. You're concerned that our successful veteran-owned farm might make your cookie-cutter McMansions look bad in comparison? I had to suppress a laugh as Marcus's face reddened. He pulled out a thick binder from his car. Here are the Pine Valley Estates community guidelines. I suggest you review them carefully. We expect all neighboring properties to comply with these standards, and I suggest you review your property maps carefully, Sarah replied, still smiling. We're not in your jurisdiction, not even close. Marcus's voice took on an edge. Mrs. Anderson, I don't think you understand. Our HOA board has significant influence with the county zoning board. It would be in your best interest to cooperate. That's when I'd had enough. Mr. Wellington, let me be clear. I served this country for 12 years to protect people's rights, including the right to farm their own land without interference from overreaching HOAs. This is private property, legally zoned for agriculture, and not subject to your guidelines. He straightened his polo shirt, trying to maintain his dignity. Very well, but don't say you weren't warned. The Pine Valley Estates HOA has ways of dealing with problematic neighbors. With that, he turned and walked back to his Mercedes, leaving a trail of designer footprints in our dusty driveway. Sarah and I watched him drive away, kicking up dust that would probably require him to get his car detailed. Again. Well, she said, I guess the honeymoon period with the neighbors is officially over. I nodded, already thinking about what this might mean for our operation. I'd faced down insurgents in Afghanistan, but something told me this battle with suburban politics might require a different kind of strategy altogether. Little did we know, Marcus Wellington III's visit was just the opening salvo in what would become a full-scale war against our farm's very existence. After Marcus's visit, things changed rapidly. At first, it was just small annoyances, complaints about our roosters crowing. We didn't even have any roosters yet. Calls to the township about imaginary odors and constant drive-bys from Pine Valley residents photographing our property. But it quickly escalated into something more systematic. The first real clash came during our weekly veteran support gathering. We had about a dozen vets working in the vegetable gardens when 3 Pine Valley Estates security vehicles parked at the end of our driveway. They just sat there, watching us through binoculars and taking pictures. It was clearly meant to intimidate, but they didn't count on who they were dealing with. Tom, our marine carpenter, straightened up from the tomato beds. Hey, Mike, this giving you Kandahar vibes, being watched by hostiles? Several other vets chuckled, but I could see the tension in their shoulders. Many of us dealt with hypervigilance after our service, and being surveilled like this was triggering. Instead of letting them rattle us, we decided to have some fun. Jenny suggested we do our work while singing cadence calls, just like in the military. Soon, our traditional military working songs were echoing across the fields. The security guards looked increasingly uncomfortable as 24 veterans belted out cadence calls while tending to organic vegetables. I don't think this was in their HOA training manual, Sarah laughed, bringing out lemonade for everyone. The security vehicles eventually left, but we knew this was just the beginning. The next day, I received an official-looking letter from the Pine Valley Estates Community Standards Enforcement Committee. It claimed that our property was in violation of multiple HOA bylaws, including unauthorized agricultural activities, excessive gatherings, and my personal favorite, non-approved singing. I took the letter to Bill Johnson, our elderly farmer neighbor, who'd been here for decades. He read it and burst out laughing. "Son, they pull this same stunt every few years when someone does something they don't like. They tried it with me. When I expanded my cornfields, just ignore them. They have zero authority here." But ignoring them became harder when they started showing up at township meetings. Marcus Wellington III would stand up during public comments, talking about community standards and proper land use. He never mentioned us directly, but everyone knew what he was referring to. The breaking point came when they tried to block our farm stand permit. We'd applied for a simple roadside stand permit to sell our eggs and vegetables. It should have been routine. We were zoned agricultural after all. But suddenly the township office was flooded with complaints about commercial activities and traffic concerns. Sarah and I attended the township meeting where our permit would be discussed. As soon as we walked in, we could see the Pine Valley crowd, all perfectly coordinated in their country club casual wear, sitting together like they were at a corporate. A board meeting. Marcus stood up first, armed with a PowerPoint presentation about property values and neighborhood character. He talked about how our farm stand would bring undesirable elements into the area. The irony of calling our disabled veteran customers undesirable wasn't lost on anyone. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I talked about our mission to help veterans through agriculture, about the therapeutic value of working the land, about the community's right to access fresh, local food. Then I played my trump card. I invited any concerned citizens to visit our farm during one of our veteran support gatherings. "Come see what we're really doing," I said. "Meet the men and women who served this country and are now finding healing through farming. Then tell me if selling their produce at a small farm stand is really going to hurt your property values." The room fell silent. Even Marcus looked uncomfortable. One by one, other community members stood up to support us. The owner of the local diner talked about how she'd been buying our eggs. A teacher described bringing her students to learn about farming. An elderly veteran tearfully thanked us for giving his grandson, who'd served in Iraq, a sense of purpose again. The permit was approved unanimously. As we left the meeting, several Pine Valley residents actually approached us to apologize for their HOA's behavior. But Marcus's face told me this battle was far from over. He'd been publicly humiliated, and something told me he wasn't the type to take that lightly. Sarah squeezed my hand as we walked to our truck. "You know this isn't the end, right?" she said. I nodded. After years in the military, I knew when I was in for a long campaign. But we had something worth fighting for, and we weren't about to back down. After our victory at the township meeting, Marcus and his HOA cronies changed tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, they started what I can only describe as a campaign of petty harassment. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one carefully designed to make our lives more difficult while maintaining plausible deniability. It started with anonymous complaints to every regulatory agency imaginable. The health department suddenly needed to inspect our chicken operation weekly. The county agricultural office received reports of suspicious plant diseases in our orchards. Environmental protection got calls about imaginary chemical runoff into the creek. Each inspection found nothing wrong, but dealing with them took time away from actual farm work. Then came the traffic interference. Pine Valley residents would deliberately drive extremely slowly past our farm stand, creating artificial congestion that they could then complain about to the township. They'd park their luxury vehicles along the road near our property, making it difficult for our customers to pull in. One afternoon, I counted 6 different Tesla Model X's crawling past our driveway at 5 miles per hour. The psychological warfare was subtle but constant. Every time we had our veteran support gatherings, Pine Valley security vehicles would park just off our property, taking photos and making notes. They'd follow our delivery truck when we made restaurant deliveries, presumably looking for any minor traffic violation they could report. "They're trying to wear us down," Jenny observed one morning as we watched yet another HOA security car drive by. Classic siege tactics, but they clearly never dealt with military logistics if they think this is going to break us. The harassment extended to our customers too. People coming to our farm stand would find their vehicles photographed by HOA security. Some reported being followed after leaving our property. A few even received letters warning them about associating with non-compliant properties. One incident particularly got under my skin. We had a school field trip scheduled, 34th graders coming to learn about farming and where their food comes from. The morning of the visit, someone we all knew who had called in a complaint about unauthorized gathering and safety concerns. The township had to send out an inspector before the kids could even get off the bus. Sarah handled it beautifully, turning the delay into a teaching moment. She had the kids sit on hay bales while she explained about farming regulations and community responsibility. By the time the inspector gave us the all clear again, the children were more excited than ever to see the farm. Their thank you letters later, covered in drawings of chickens and vegetables, made it all worthwhile. Our veteran community stood firmly behind us. Tom started organizing security patrols of his own, with veterans volunteering to watch over the farm at night. Jenny documented every incident of harassment, building a detailed log with photos and videos. Mike, our medic turned herbalist, even set up wildlife cameras around the property perimeter to catch any potential trespassing. The local media started taking notice. A small article in the county paper about HOA overreach turned into a larger story about veteran-owned farms and community support. Every negative review the HOA tried to plant online was countered by dozens of genuine positive ones from our customers and supporters. We adapted and overcame just like we'd been trained to do. When they complained about noise, we adjusted our work schedules. When they reported us for lights at night, we installed motion sensor solar lamps. When they tried to block customer parking, we created a new entrance on the other side of the property. But it was exhausting. Every day brought new challenges, new complaints, new obstacles to navigate. Sarah would often find me at the kitchen table late at night, poring over regulations and permit requirements, making sure we were bulletproof against any potential violations. "They're hoping we'll get tired and give up," she said one evening, bringing me a cup of coffee. "But they don't understand what they're dealing with. This isn't just a farm, it's a mission." She was right. Every time I watched a fellow veteran find peace working in our gardens, every time a customer thanked us for bringing fresh food to the community, every time a child's face lit up seeing a chicken lay an egg, I knew this was worth fighting for. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was building up to something bigger. These petty annoyances felt like probing attacks, testing our defenses before the main assault. I'd seen similar tactics in Afghanistan, the small harassment operations that preceded larger coordinated attacks. I just didn't expect the next phase of his campaign to be quite so dramatic or so personal. The first real confrontation happened on a crisp Saturday morning during our busiest farmers' market hour. I was helping a customer load their car with fresh vegetables when Marcus Wellington Three came storming across our parking area, waving a stack of papers and flanked by two other HOA board members in matching polo shirts. "Anderson!" he bellowed, loud enough to make several customers jump. "This ends now!" He was red-faced, his designer polo wrinkled from what I assumed was righteous HOA indignation. The customers loading their cars stopped to watch, phones already, coming out to record whatever was about to unfold. I kept my voice calm and steady, just like I'd been trained for tense situations. "Mr. Wellington, I'm with customers right now. If you'd like to discuss something, we can set up a proper meeting." But he wasn't having it. "Your unauthorized commercial farming operation is a disgrace to this community." He thrust the papers toward me. "These are satellite images showing the extent of your agricultural violations. Look at this. Vegetable gardens visible from the street, free-range chickens, an orchard that hasn't been properly manicured." Sarah had come out of the farm stand by this point, and our veteran volunteers were watching closely from their various posts around the property. I could see Tom and Jenny slowly moving closer, ready to intervene if needed. "Mr. Wellington," I said, still keeping my voice level, "we've been through this. We're properly zoned for agriculture. This is a legal farming operation. We're not part of your HOA. This is an eyesore," he shouted, gesturing wildly at our thriving gardens. "Our residents shouldn't have to look at working farms from their breakfast nooks. Do you have any idea what this is doing to property values?" One of our regular customers, an elderly woman who'd been buying our eggs since we opened, stepped forward. "Young man," she addressed Marcus, "I drove through your Pine Valley Estates the other day. All those identical houses with their identical lawns. Now that's an eyesore. This farm is beautiful." Marcus's face got even redder. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. This is between the HOA and these agricultural vagrants." That's when I lost my cool a bit. "Agricultural vagrants? Is that what you call disabled? Veterans trying to heal through honest work? Is that what you call people growing food for their community?" "Oh, please," he sneered, "don't play the veteran card. This isn't about your service. This is about maintaining community standards, your farm animals, your vegetable patches, your constant gatherings of what, Mr. Wellington?" Jenny stepped forward, still wearing her prosthetic leg proudly. "Of veterans. Is that what offends you? The sight of wounded warriors finding peace through farming." The crowd that had gathered was murmuring now, most of them filming on their phones. Marcus seemed to suddenly realize he was creating quite a spectacle, and not in his favor. "This isn't over, Anderson," he said, trying to regain his composure. "You clearly have no respect for proper suburban values. We'll see how your little farming experiment holds up under proper scrutiny." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, "Mr. Wellington." He paused. "Would you like to buy some fresh eggs? They're from happy chickens that don't care about suburban values." The crowd burst out laughing, and Marcus practically ran back to his Mercedes, his HOA minions trailing behind him. As soon as they left, our customers burst into applause. The incident might have been amusing if it hadn't signaled such a clear escalation in Marcus's campaign against us. This wasn't just about property values anymore. This was personal, and he was clearly prepared to go to extreme lengths to shut us down. That evening, as Sarah and I sat on our porch watching the sunset over our flourishing fields, we knew something bigger was coming. The question wasn't if Marcus would strike again, but when and how hard. "He's desperate," Sarah observed, sipping her tea. "He's losing control of the narrative, and he knows it." I nodded. In the military, we learned that a desperate enemy is often the most dangerous. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. We had no idea then just how right we were, or how far Marcus Wellington III would go in his crusade against our farm. The real battle was just beginning. Despite Marcus's threats, the next few weeks were surprisingly peaceful. Our farm flourished. In the early summer warmth, and the veteran support program grew beyond our wildest expectations. We had over 30 regular participants now, each finding their own path to healing through agriculture. The chicken operation was running smoothly, with our heritage breeds producing more eggs than we could sell at the farm stand. Several high-end restaurants in town had started featuring our produce on their menus, proudly advertising their support of veteran-owned agriculture. The apple trees were showing promising signs of revival, with the first blossoms appearing on branches we'd carefully pruned. Our informal therapy sessions had evolved into structured programs. Mike, our medic-turned-herbalist, started teaching classes on medicinal plants. Jenny organized workshops on small engine repair and basic farm equipment maintenance. Tom's carpentry sessions became so popular we had to create a waiting list. The local media coverage had done us more good than harm. People would drive from 3 counties away to buy our produce and meet the veterans working the land. A documentary filmmaker even reached out about featuring us in a piece about alternative therapy for PTSD. "It's like we're living the dream," Sarah said one evening as we watched a group of vets building a new greenhouse. "Almost too good to be true." I knew what she meant. After months of constant harassment, this piece felt strange. Every morning I'd wake up expecting new complaints or violations, but none came. The HOA security vehicles had stopped their surveillance, and even the Pine Valley residents had ceased their slow drive-bys. Our success was visible everywhere you looked. The vegetable gardens were bursting with life, neat rows of tomatoes, peppers and leafy greens stretching toward the sun. The medicinal herb garden had become a butterfly haven, just as we'd hoped. The old barn, now fully restored, hosted weekly community events and veteran support meetings. We'd even started a mentorship program, pairing experienced veteran farmers with newcomers interested in agriculture. The VA hospital in the next county began referring veterans to us for therapeutic farming sessions. What had started as a personal healing journey was becoming a model for veteran rehabilitation through agriculture. One particularly beautiful morning, I was working in the orchard with a group of vets when Bill Johnson, our elderly farmer neighbor, came by. He stood for a while watching us work before speaking. "You've done something special here, Mike," he said, leaning on the fence. "Haven't seen this land so alive in 40 years. Your daddy would be proud." Coming from Bill, who'd known my father during his own military service, that meant everything. We'd created more than just a farm. We'd built a community, a haven for those who'd served and needed a place to heal. The farm stand had become a local gathering spot. Customers would linger, chatting with the veterans about farming techniques or sharing stories about their own service. Children would come with their parents to see the chickens and learn about where their food came from. Even some Pine Valley residents would sneak over, usually early in the morning, when their neighbors wouldn't see them. But something about this peace nagged at me. 15 years in the military teaches you to trust your instincts, and mine were screaming that this was the calm before the storm. Marcus Wellington III wasn't the type to admit defeat, especially not after being publicly humiliated. Sarah noticed my unease. "You're waiting for the other boot to drop, aren't you?" I nodded. "Marcus is planning something. This quiet, it's tactical. He's regrouping, gathering resources for something bigger." "We've handled everything he's thrown at us so far," she reminded me. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." She was right, of course. We had a strong community behind us now, a purpose bigger than ourselves, and a track record of standing our ground. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's next move would be different, something we hadn't prepared for. I just didn't expect it to come in the form of a certified letter delivered on a quiet Sunday morning, threatening to destroy everything we'd built. The certified letter arrived early Sunday morning while we were doing our regular farm chores. The delivery person looked uncomfortable, as if they knew they were carrying bad news. Sarah signed for it while I finished feeding the chickens, and by the time I got back to the house, she was standing in the kitchen, face pale, holding the opened envelope. "Mike, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. I wiped my hands on my jeans and took the official-looking document. The letterhead read, Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association, Community Standards Enforcement Division. But it was the number at the bottom that made my blood run cold. $50,000. According to the letter, our farm was being fined for extensive and willful violations of community standards. The itemized list was almost comical in its absurdity. $10,000 for unauthorized agricultural activities, $15,000 for livestock-related nuisances, $12,000 for improper land use, and $13,000 for degradation of community aesthetic values. But the real kicker came in the final paragraph. If we didn't pay the fine and restore the property to acceptable standards within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on our property and initiate foreclosure proceedings. "They can't do this," Sarah whispered, reading over my shoulder. "We're not even in their HOA. This is insane." I read through the document again, noting Marcus Wellington III's signature at the bottom, along with 2 other board members. The letter was filled with legal jargon and citations from their HOA bylaws, carefully worded to sound official and threatening. "This is their big play," I said, setting the letter down on our kitchen table. "They're trying to force us out through legal intimidation." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Check your email. All the veteran participants got letters too." Sure enough, when I opened my email, there were dozens of messages from our veteran community members. The HOA had sent them, all warning letters, threatening legal action if they continued to participate in unauthorized agricultural activities on our property. "They're not just attacking us," Sarah realized, reading the emails. "They're trying to isolate us from our support network." The phone started ringing. First Tom, then Mike, then other vets from our program, all having received similar threats. Some were worried about legal implications, others were angry, but all wanted to know what we were going to do. I spent the next hour on the phone trying to calm everyone down while my own mind raced with possibilities. We'd dealt with Marcus's harassment before, but this was different. This was a coordinated legal assault designed to destroy not just our farm, but the entire support system we'd built around it. By afternoon, word had spread through the community. Our regular customers started showing up at the farm stand, not just to buy produce, but to offer support. Bill Johnson came over with a stack of historical property documents, proving that our land had been zoned agricultural since before Pine Valley Estates even existed. They tried this same stunt with eminent domain back in '85, Bill explained, spreading the papers on our kitchen table. Wanted to expand their development onto my land. Didn't work then, won't work now. But this felt different. The amount they were demanding, $50,000, wasn't random. It was carefully calculated to be just enough to cause serious financial strain, but not so outrageous that it would immediately be thrown out of court. Fighting it would mean expensive legal fees, time away from the farm, and potential damage to our reputation, even if we won. Sarah found me in the barn that evening, sitting alone in the gathering darkness. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me and took my hand. "You know what this really is?" I finally said. "This is Marcus betting that we don't have the resources or the will to fight back. He thinks we'll either pay up or sell out just to avoid the hassle. He doesn't know who he's dealing with," Sarah replied firmly. "We've faced worse than some suburban tyrant with a power complex." She was right, but this wasn't just about us anymore. This was about every veteran who'd found healing on our farm, every customer who depended on our produce, every principle we'd fought to defend both in uniform and out of it. "We need a strategy," I said, standing up, "and we need legal help. Real legal help, not just friendly advice." I might know someone, Sarah said thoughtfully. Remember Rachel from college? She specializes in property law now, and her father was a Marine. I nodded, already forming a plan. Marcus Wellington III had just declared war on everything we'd built. He was about to learn that veterans don't back down from a fight, especially when we're fighting for something worth defending. The next letter from Pine Valley Estates arrived exactly 1 week later, even more threatening than the first. This time, they'd increased the fine to $75,000, citing continued defiance of community standards and aggressive agricultural expansion. They'd also shortened their deadline to 14 days and added a new threat. They would seek criminal charges for operating an unauthorized business venture. "They're escalating," Rachel said, reading through the new letter in our kitchen. Sarah's college friend had driven 3 hours to meet with us as soon as she heard about our situation. "This is classic intimidation tactics. They're hoping to overwhelm you with threats before you can mount a proper legal defense." I watched as she meticulously documented each claim in the letter, occasionally shaking her head or making notes in the margins. 20 years of military service had taught me to read people well, and I could see the controlled anger in her movements. "The criminal charges threat is particularly egregious," she continued, highlighting a paragraph. "They have absolutely no authority to bring criminal charges, and they know it. This is borderline legal malpractice." Sarah placed coffee mugs in front of us. "So what are they really after? The money?" Rachel leaned back, running her hands through her graying hair. "No, this isn't about money. This is about control and precedent. If they can force a legally operating farm to submit to their authority, even though you're not in their HOA, it would give them unprecedented power over the entire area." The implications were chilling. If Marcus succeeded, it wouldn't just affect us. It would threaten every independent property owner in the vicinity of Pine Valley Estates. "They've also done their homework," Rachel continued, pulling out more papers. "Look at these satellite images they've included. They've documented every change we've made to the property, every new garden bed, every structure. They're trying to build a case that we're fundamentally altering the character of the neighborhood." "We're a farm," I said, feeling my frustration rise. "Of course we're altering the land. That's what farming is." "Exactly," Rachel nodded. "But they're trying to frame it as industrial development rather than agriculture. See these citations? They're referencing commercial zoning laws, not agricultural ones." Just then, Jenny burst through the door, not bothering to knock. "Mike, you need to see this." She pulled up a social media post on her phone. It was from the Pine Valley Estates official page, warning residents about health and safety risks from our farm. They'd posted pictures of our chicken coops and vegetable gardens, but the photos were clearly manipulated to make everything look unkempt and dangerous. "They're trying to turn public opinion against us," Sarah said quietly, looking at the post. "Make us look like a threat to community safety." Rachel was already taking notes. "This is good," she said, surprising us. "They're overplaying their hand. False statements about health and safety risks, that's defamation. We can use this." The rest of the morning was spent building our defense strategy. Rachel explained that while their threats were mostly empty, we needed to take them seriously and respond formally. She started drafting a legal response that would not only refute their claims, but potentially expose them to countersuit for harassment and defamation. "Here's what they're not telling you," she said, spreading out a map of the area. "Pine Valley Estates has been trying to expand for years. Your property and Bill Johnson's are the only things standing in their way. This isn't just about your farm, it's about their development plans." The pieces started falling into place. The excessive fines, the escalating threats, the public smear campaign. It was all designed to force us out so they could buy the land for their expansion. "But they didn't count on one thing." Rachel smiled, pulling out another document. "The veterans program you've built here. It's protected under several federal and state programs supporting veteran rehabilitation and agriculture. They're not just fighting you, they're potentially interfering with protected veteran services. For the first time since this started, I felt a glimmer of hope. We weren't just facing a bully with money and lawyers. We had laws and programs on our side, and more importantly, we had truth and community support. "So what's our next move?" Sarah asked, squeezing my hand under the table. Rachel's eyes gleamed with determination. "We're going to turn their own tactics against them. Every threat, every false claim, every manipulated photo. It's all going to come back to haunt them. But first," she said, pulling out her phone, "I need to make some calls. I know some people at the State Attorney General's office who would be very interested in an HOA attempting to regulate property outside their jurisdiction." Marcus Wellington III had just picked a fight with the wrong farm. He thought he was dealing with simple farmers who would bow to legal pressure. Instead, he was about to face a coordinated response from veterans, lawyers, and state officials who understood exactly what was at stake. The war for our farm was about to enter a new phase, and this time we were ready. I found Marcus outside our farm stand early Tuesday morning, his Mercedes blocking our delivery truck from leaving. He had another stack of papers in his hand, but this time, instead of his usual arrogant smirk, his face showed genuine anger. "You think you're clever, don't you, Anderson?" he spat, waving a copy of our legal response that Rachel had prepared. "Getting your fancy lawyer involved, making threats about federal protection programs. This could have been simple, but you had to make it difficult." I kept loading boxes of fresh vegetables into our truck, deliberately ignoring his attempt to intimidate. "Mr. Wellington, unless you're here to buy some organic produce, you're trespassing on private property." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me very carefully. I've invested too much in this community to let some farmer with a sob story about veteran rehabilitation ruin everything. Pine Valley Estates is expanding, whether you like it or not." I stopped what I was doing and turned to face him fully. "So that's what this is really about. Not community standards or property values. You want our land for development. We're offering you a way out," he said, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was reasonable. "Pay the fine, admit the violations, and we'll help you relocate somewhere more appropriate. Somewhere your little therapy garden won't interfere with progress." Just then, Tom and Jenny pulled up in Tom's old pickup truck. They'd started arriving early every morning to help with deliveries since the harassment began. Marcus glanced at them nervously but continued. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he said. "I have connections in the county government, the zoning board, the building department. I can make your life very difficult." "No, Mr. Wellington," I replied calmly, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. We defended this country's freedoms, including the right to farm our own land without interference from people like you." His face reddened. "Your military service doesn't give you the right to ignore community standards. This isn't Afghanistan. Anderson, you can't just do whatever you want." That's when Jenny stepped forward, her prosthetic leg clearly visible beneath her shorts. "Actually, Mr. Wellington, our military service gives us a pretty good perspective on what matters. And bullies with too much money trying to push people around, that's not it." Marcus took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience. Some of our early morning customers had started arriving, phones out, recording the confrontation. "This is your final warning," he said, trying to regain his composure. "Either comply with our demands or face the consequences. We'll bury you. In so much legal paperwork you won't have time to plant a single seed." Tom crossed his arms. "Funny thing about veterans, sir, we're pretty good at dealing with paperwork. Comes from all that military bureaucracy training." Marcus threw the papers at my feet and stormed back to his Mercedes. As he peeled out of our driveway, throwing gravel, Sarah came out of the house. "I got it all on video," she said, holding up her phone, including the part where he admitted this was about development plans, not community standards. Rachel's going to love this. I picked up the scattered papers. More threats, more fines, more deadlines. But this time, they felt hollow. Marcus had shown his true colors, and more importantly, he'd revealed his real motives on camera. "He's desperate," Jenny observed, helping me gather the papers. "His whole development plan probably depends on getting this land." Sarah nodded. "And now we have proof that this isn't about HOA violations. It's about forced acquisition through harassment." I looked at our flourishing farm, the neat rows of vegetables, the happy chickens, the restored barn where veterans found purpose and healing. Marcus Wellington III might have money and connections, but we had something stronger, a community worth fighting for, and the determination to protect it. "Get the deliveries done," I told Tom and Jenny, "then call Rachel. She needs to see this video right away." As they drove off with the morning's produce, I couldn't help but smile. Marcus had just made a serious tactical error, and he didn't even realize it. In trying to intimidate us, he'd given us exactly what we needed, evidence of his true intentions. The battle for our farm was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like we had more than just the moral high ground. We had proof, we had witnesses, and most importantly, we had the truth on our side. Rachel worked fast. Within 48 hours of receiving Sarah's video of Marcus's confrontation, she had assembled a comprehensive legal response that would turn the tables on Pine Valley Estates. We gathered in our barn, which had become our unofficial war room, to review the strategy. "First," Rachel said, spreading documents across the old wooden table, "we're filing a countersuit for harassment, intimidation, and attempted property theft through coercion. The video of Marcus admitting this is about development plans rather than HOA violations is golden. But that's just the beginning." She pulled out more papers, affidavits from veteran participants in our program, statements from neighboring property owners who'd faced similar pressure from Pine Valley Estates, and documentation of every incident of harassment we'd experienced. "But here's where it gets interesting," she continued, her eyes lighting up. "I did some digging into Pine Valley Estates' expansion plans. Guess what I found? They've been secretly buying up options on surrounding properties, using shell companies to hide their intentions. They're planning a massive development project, and your farm sits right in the middle of their planned luxury shopping complex." Sarah leaned forward. "Is that legal?" "The property purchases?" "Yes, using an HOA to harass non-member properties into selling. Absolutely not." Rachel pulled out another document. "And here's the best part. They've already started advertising the development to investors. They're selling something they don't own yet." Jenny, who'd been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "So they're not just bullying us. They're committing fraud." "Potentially," Rachel nodded. "They're representing to investors that they have control over properties they don't own, including yours." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about our farm anymore. It was about exposing a systematic attempt to force out small landowners for corporate profit. "There's more," Rachel continued. "Remember those health and safety complaints they filed? I pulled the records. Every single inspection came back clean, but they kept filing complaints, using HOA resources to harass a legitimate business. That's abusive process. I thought about all the time we'd spent dealing with inspectors, all the worry about violations that didn't exist. Can we use that?" "Already on it," Rachel smiled. "I've drafted a complaint to the State Attorney General's office. They're very interested in HOAs that overstep their authority, especially when it impacts veteran support programs." She pulled out another document, a thick application for something called the Veterans Agricultural Support Program. "While we're fighting them legally, we're also going to strengthen your position. This federal program provides grants and legal protection for farms that support veteran rehabilitation. Once you're certified, any attempt to interfere with your operations could be considered interference with the federal program. Tom, who'd been quietly listening, grinned. So while they're trying to bury us in paperwork, we're going to bury them in federal protection? Exactly, Rachel confirmed. But we need to move fast. I want all this filed before they realize what's happening. We spent the next several hours going through documents, signing papers, and recording detailed statements about every interaction with Pine Valley Estates. Rachel was thorough, making sure every claim was backed by evidence. One more thing, she said as we finished. I want to bring in the media, not just local news. I'm talking about national coverage. A story about wealthy developers using an HOA to try to shut down a veteran therapy farm. That's the kind of thing that goes viral. Sarah looked concerned. Won't that escalate things? That's exactly what we want, Rachel explained. Right now, they're operating in the shadows, using quiet pressure and legal threats. We need to drag this into the light, make it so public that their investors start asking questions. She was right. Marcus and his HOA board were counting on our silence, on our fear of conflict. But we were done being quiet. Do it, I said. All of it. The countersuit, the federal program application, the media coverage. It's time to show them what they're really up against. Rachel gathered her papers, a determined look in her eyes. I'll file everything first thing tomorrow, but be prepared. They're going to hit back hard when they realize what we're doing. As we walked her to her car, I could see Marcus's house in the distance, its perfectly manicured lawn glowing in the evening light. He thought he was fighting simple farmers who would fold under pressure. Instead, he was about to face a legal and public relations battle that would expose everything he'd been trying to hide. One more thing, Rachel said before leaving. Start documenting everything. Every phone call, every drive-by, every interaction. The next few weeks are going to be crucial. We watched her drive away, the sun setting behind our barn. The battle for our farm was entering a new phase, and this time we weren't just playing defense. We were taking the fight to them. With Rachel's guidance, we began methodically building our case. Every veteran who'd participated in our program wrote detailed statements about how the farm had helped their recovery. Jenny set up a sophisticated surveillance system around the property, documenting every instance of HOA harassment. Tom organized our growing pile of evidence into clear chronological order. The most powerful evidence came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Chen, whose restaurant had been buying our produce, provided screenshots of threatening emails she'd received from Pine Valley Estates, warning her about doing business with us. The local school principal wrote a letter describing how our educational programs had benefited her students and how HOA members had tried to pressure the school board to cancel field trips to our farm. But the real breakthrough came from Bill Johnson. One evening, he showed up at our door with a dusty box of documents he'd kept from his own battles with Pine Valley Estates. Been fighting these folks for 30 years, he said, setting the box on our kitchen table. Kept everything. Might find something useful in there. We spent hours going through the papers. There were letters, legal documents, and newspaper clippings dating back to the 1980s. A pattern emerged. Pine Valley Estates had a long history of trying to force out neighboring farmers through harassment and legal threats. Look at this, Sarah said, holding up a yellowed newspaper article. 1992, they tried to claim jurisdiction over the Miller dairy farm. Same tactics. Fines, threats, claims about property values. The Millers fought back and won. The documents revealed something else. Marcus Wellington III wasn't the first in his family to use these tactics. His father, the original developer of Pine Valley Estates, had employed similar strategies to expand the development. Jenny discovered photographs showing how Pine Valley had gradually encroached on agricultural land over the years. They're like a slow-moving invasion, she observed. taking a little more land each time, using the HOA as their weapon. We organized everything into a comprehensive timeline showing decades of systematic harassment of neighboring properties. Rachel was ecstatic when we shared our findings. "This is exactly what we needed," she said during our next strategy session. "We can show this isn't an isolated incident. It's a long-term pattern of predatory behavior. The State Attorney General's office is very interested in this history." Tom had been particularly thorough in documenting recent events. His military training in intelligence gathering proved invaluable. He'd created detailed logs of every HOA security vehicle that monitored our property, complete with times, license plates, and photographs. "They're watching us an average of 6 hours a day," he reported, showing us his data. "Always the same 3 vehicles, rotating shifts. That's not HOA security, that's surveillance." We also started gathering evidence about Pine Valley's planned expansion. Through public records requests, we uncovered building permits, zoning, change applications, and environmental impact studies, all filed before they'd even approached us about selling. They were so confident they'd force us out, they'd already started the approval process, Sarah said, reviewing the documents. "Talk about counting your chickens before they hatch." Rachel helped us organize everything into a compelling narrative. The story wasn't just about our farm anymore. It was about a decades-long pattern of wealthy developers using HOA regulations to bully small landowners into selling. "This is why they're so desperate now," Rachel explained. "They've already committed to investors. They've spent money on permits and studies. If they can't acquire your land, their whole expansion plan falls apart. The evidence gathering wasn't without cost. Our daily farm operations had to continue despite the time we spent documenting and organizing. The veteran support programs kept running, the vegetables needed tending, and the chickens still had to be fed. But our community stepped up. The local farmers sent workers to help with harvests. Customers volunteered to staff the farm stand. Veterans from neighboring counties came to help with maintenance and repairs. "They thought they could isolate us," Jenny observed one evening, as we watched a group of volunteers helping with the evening chores. "Instead, they've made us stronger. We knew Marcus and his HOA board wouldn't go down without a fight. They had money, influence, and a lot to lose. But we had something more powerful: truth, community support, and decades of evidence showing exactly what they'd been doing." Rachel was preparing to file our countersuit, complete with all the historical evidence and recent documentation. The State Attorney General's office was reviewing our complaint. Local news stations were starting to ask questions about Pine Valley Estates expansion plans. The quiet farm life we'd dreamed of had turned into something very different. A battle for justice that went far beyond our property lines. But as I watched our community come together to help us fight, I knew we'd already won something more valuable than land. We'd exposed a truth that needed to be told, and in doing so, we'd built something Marcus Wellington III and his HOA could never buy or bully into submission. A genuine community united against corruption. The official hearing date was set for July 15th. The State Attorney General's office had moved surprisingly quickly after reviewing our evidence, particularly the historical documentation from Bill Johnson. We were scheduled to appear before the County Property Rights Commission, with representatives from the State AG's office in attendance. Rachel had prepared us well for what to expect. "They'll try to paint you as troublemakers," she explained. "During our final prep session, they'll argue that you're disrupting the established community, that your farm is a nuisance. But we have something they don't expect: decades of evidence showing their pattern of behavior." The morning of the hearing, our supporters filled the parking lot of the county courthouse. Veterans from our program, customers from the farm stand, neighboring farmers, and even some Pine Valley residents who'd grown tired of their HOA's tyranny. They all came to show solidarity. Inside the hearing room, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side sat Marcus Wellington III with his team of corporate lawyers, all in identical dark suits. On our side were Sarah and me, Rachel, and our key witnesses, all dressed in what Sarah called respectable farmer casual. The commission chairman, a stern-looking woman named Judge Martinez, called the hearing to order. We're here today to address multiple complaints and counter-complaints regarding Pine Valley Estates HOA and Anderson Family Farm. This is not a formal court proceeding, but our findings will be legally binding. Mr. Wellington, as the initial complainant, you may begin. Marcus's lead attorney stood, straightening his $1,000 tie. Thank you, Your Honor. We're here today because the Andersons have repeatedly and willfully violated community standards established to protect property values and quality of life in our area. Their agricultural activities are disruptive. Their gatherings are noisy, and their failure to comply with HOA guidelines shows a blatant disregard for community harmony. He went on to present their case: satellite photos of our farm's expansion, complaints about chicken noise, still no roosters, concerns about traffic to the farm stand. It was all carefully crafted to make us sound like inconsiderate neighbors who refused to play by the rules. Then Rachel stood up. Your Honor, before we present our response, I'd like to establish one key fact. The Anderson property is not now, nor has it ever been, part of Pine Valley Estates HOA. They have no legal authority over this land. She proceeded to lay out our case methodically. First came the historical evidence: 30 years of documented harassment of neighboring properties by Pine Valley Estates. Then the recent evidence: videos of Marcus admitting their true development plans, documentation of their harassment campaign, testimony from community members who'd been threatened. But most importantly, Rachel continued, we have evidence that Pine Valley Estates has already sold investors on a development plan that requires land they don't own. They're using HOA regulations as a weapon to force out legitimate landowners for their own profit. The room grew tense as Rachel presented document after document: maps showing Pine Valley's secret expansion plans, permits filed before they'd even approached us about selling, evidence of shell companies they'd used to hide property purchases. When Bill Johnson testified about his decades of dealing with Pine Valley's tactics, Marcus couldn't hide his discomfort. When Jenny presented her detailed logs of HOA surveillance of our property, his lawyers started whispering urgently among themselves. But the most powerful testimony came from our veteran participants. One by one, they stood up to describe how our farm had helped them heal, how the HOA's harassment had affected their therapy, how important this space was for their recovery. Marcus's attorneys tried to object, claiming these personal stories were irrelevant to the property dispute. Judge Martinez overruled them. The impact on the community is absolutely relevant to this case, she stated firmly. By the time Rachel finished our presentation, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Even some of Pine Valley's own residents in attendance looked shocked by the evidence of their HOA's actions. Judge Martinez called for a brief recess before final arguments. As we stood in the hallway, Sarah squeezed my hand. Whatever happens, she whispered, we've exposed the truth. That counts for something. Rachel was conferring with the state AG's representatives, who looked increasingly interested in Pine Valley's business practices. Marcus and his lawyers were huddled in a corner, their confident demeanor from the morning notably absent. Our supporters offered encouragement and support during the break. Tom, ever the tactical thinker, was already planning how to use the hearing's findings to protect other local farmers from similar harassment. As we waited to be called back in, I couldn't help but feel proud, not just of our fight, but of how our community had come together. We'd turned a simple property dispute into something much more important, a stand against corporate bullying and the abuse of power. The bailiff announced the recess was ending. As we filed back into the hearing room, I caught Marcus's eye. For the first time since this began, he looked worried. He was finally realizing that money and influence weren't always enough to win every battle. The real question was, would justice prevail, or would power and money win the day? The tension in the hearing room was palpable as everyone returned from recess. Judge Martinez shuffled through her notes, her expression unreadable. Sarah gripped my hand under the table as we waited. For the final arguments to begin, Marcus's legal team went first, but their confidence had clearly been shaken by our evidence. Their lead attorney's voice wavered slightly as he tried to reframe the narrative. While some of the evidence presented may seem concerning, we must remember that Pine Valley Estates has always acted in the best interest of the community. The Anderson farm, regardless of its noble intentions, represents a disruption to the established order of our neighborhood. Rachel's final argument was brief but powerful. Your Honor, this case is about more than property rights or community standards. It's about the systematic abuse of HOA authority to force out legitimate landowners for corporate profit. The evidence shows a clear pattern of harassment, intimidation, and fraudulent business practices spanning decades. The Andersons' farm isn't disrupting the community, it's enriching it, providing valuable services to veterans and fresh food to local residents. Pine Valley Estates' actions threaten not just this farm, but the rights of every independent property owner in the area. Judge Martinez spoke. Before I call for deliberation, is there anything else either party would like to add? Marcus suddenly stood up, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to stop him. Your Honor, if I may speak. His face was flushed, his usual polished demeanor cracking. This is ridiculous. We are trying to protect our community's values. These people, he gestured, dismissively at us. They don't understand what we're trying to build here. Their farm, their veterans programs, their chickens. It all threatens everything we've worked for. Property values, community standards, our vision for the future. Your vision, Judge Martinez interrupted, or your profit margins, Mr. Wellington. The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus's face reddened further as he realized his outburst had only strengthened our case. His lawyers looked mortified. Judge Martinez called for deliberation, but something in her tone suggested she'd already reached a conclusion. Given the extensive evidence presented and the serious nature of the allegations, I'll need time to review everything thoroughly. We'll reconvene in 2 hours. Those 2 hours felt like an eternity. Our supporters gathered in the courthouse cafeteria, sharing coffee and nervous conversation. Jenny kept updating her evidence logs, just in case. Tom organized an impromptu security detail to watch our vehicles, concerned that Pine Valley might try something desperate. Rachel spent the time conferring with the state AG representatives, who seemed increasingly interested in launching a broader investigation into Pine Valley Estates' business practices. Whatever happens today, she told us, this isn't over. The state has enough evidence to look into their whole operation. Sarah and I sat quietly in a corner, watching our community rally around us. Local farmers discussed creating a mutual support network to protect against future HOA encroachment. Veterans from our program shared stories about how the farm had changed their lives. Even a few Pine Valley residents approached us quietly, expressing support and sharing their own stories of HOA intimidation. We've already won something here, Sarah observed, watching everyone interact. Look at how this has brought people together. Finally, we were called back into the hearing room. Judge Martinez sat at her desk, a thick stack of documents in front of her. The room fell silent as she prepared to speak. Marcus and his team looked tense, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible concern, Our side waited quietly, united in whatever was to come. "Before I announce my findings," Judge Martinez began, "I want to make something clear. This case has revealed issues that go far beyond a simple property dispute. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of behavior that demands further investigation by appropriate authorities." She looked directly at Marcus as she continued. "However, my immediate concern is with the specific complaints and counter-complaints before this commission. Based on the extensive evidence presented, I'm prepared to render my decision." The room held its breath. Everything we'd built, everything we'd fought for, hung on what came next. Whatever Judge Martinez decided would either validate our fight for justice or give Pine Valley Estates the power to continue their predatory practices. Sarah squeezed my hand harder as we waited for the words that would determine our fate. Judge Martinez cleared her throat and began delivering her decision with measured precision. First, regarding Pine Valley Estates' complaints against Anderson Family Farm, all fines and violations are hereby invalidated. The HOA has no legal authority over properties outside its jurisdiction, and their attempts to exert such authority constitute harassment. A murmur of approval rippled through our supporters. Marcus's face darkened, but Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, the evidence presented today reveals deeply troubling patterns of behavior by Pine Valley Estates HOA. Their actions go beyond simple overreach. They demonstrate a systematic attempt to use HOA authority as a weapon for corporate acquisition. She lifted a document from her stack. The $50,000 fine, which was later increased to $75,000, was clearly punitive and retaliatory. There was no legal basis for these fines, and the attempts to enforce them through threats of property liens constitute attempted extortion. Marcus's lawyers started frantically scribbling notes as Judge Martinez continued. "The Commission hereby orders Pine Valley Estates to cease all harassment and surveillance of the Anderson property immediately. Any future attempts to exert HOA authority over non-member properties will result in severe penalties." Then came the part that made Marcus physically flinch. "Additionally, I am referring evidence of Pine Valley Estates business practices to the State Attorney General's Office for further investigation. The documentation of pre-sold developments on land not yet acquired, the use of shell companies to hide property purchases, and the pattern of harassment against neighboring landowners all warrant thorough examination." She turned to address us directly. "As for the Andersons' counter-complaints, this commission finds in your favor. Pine Valley Estates HOA is hereby ordered to pay damages for harassment and legal expenses, totaling $150,000. The room erupted in cheers, but Judge Martinez raised her hand for silence. "One more thing. The veteran rehabilitation programs operating on the Anderson farm are now officially recognized as protected activities under state law. Any attempt to interfere with these programs will be considered a violation of veteran service protections." She closed her folder with finality. "This decision is binding and will be enforced by county authorities. Mr. Wellington, I strongly suggest you direct your HOA's energy toward managing its own community rather than harassing your neighbors. This hearing is adjourned." The victory felt surreal. Our supporters burst into applause as Marcus and his team quickly gathered their papers and fled the room. Rachel was beaming as she shook our hands. "This is better than we could have hoped for. Not just a win, but complete vindication." Jenny was already on her phone, spreading the news to veterans who couldn't attend. Tom stood guard at the door, making sure none of Marcus's people tried any last-minute stunts. Bill Johnson, our elderly farmer neighbor, had tears in his eyes. 30 years I've been fighting these people. Finally, someone stood up to them and won. Sarah hugged me tight, whispering, "We did it. We actually did it. But Rachel reminded us that our work wasn't done. The state AG's investigation will take time. They'll need your continued cooperation and documentation, and you can bet Pine Valley won't take this lying down. They'll find other ways to cause trouble. She was right, of course. This victory was significant, but it was just one. A battle in a longer war. Still, we had achieved something important. We'd shown that regular people could stand up to corporate bullies and win. We'd protected not just our farm, but created a precedent that could help other landowners facing similar harassment. As we left the courthouse, our supporters formed an impromptu honor guard. Veterans stood at attention, farmers raised their caps, and even some Pine Valley residents came to shake our hands and apologize for their HOA's behavior. Looking at all these people, our community united in victory, I felt a pride deeper than any I'd experienced in the military. We'd fought for something bigger than ourselves and won. Our farm wasn't just safe, it was now a symbol of resistance against corporate overreach and a protected haven for veterans seeking healing through agriculture. Sarah summed it up perfectly as we drove home. You know what the best part is? Tomorrow morning, we get to go back to being farmers, just farmers who don't have to worry about HOA harassment anymore. But first, we had some celebrating to do, and maybe, just maybe, we'd position our new victory banner where Marcus could see it from his breakfast nook. The day after our victory at the hearing, we received news that shook Pine Valley Estates to its core. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting, and the results were dramatic. Multiple board members, seeing the writing on the wall, had resigned rather than face potential investigation by the State Attorney General's office. But the biggest shock came from Marcus Wellington III himself. He resigned not just from his position as HOA president, but from the board entirely. The official statement cited personal reasons, but we knew better. The state AG's investigation into Pine Valley's business practices had spooked their investors, and the entire development project was unraveling. Rachel called early that morning with the details. Their whole house of cards is collapsing, she explained. Those investors who were promised a luxury shopping complex, they're pulling out left and right. Nobody wants to be associated with a development that's under state investigation for fraudulent practices. More revelations followed throughout the day. Jenny, who had maintained connections with some Pine Valley residents, reported that Marcus had been quietly trying to sell his house. Apparently, he's being called back to the corporate office to explain the situation, she said with a satisfied smirk. The remaining HOA board members, desperate to salvage their reputation, issued a formal apology to our farm and other neighboring properties. They promised to reform their practices and stick to managing their own community rather than trying to control surrounding areas. Sarah found me in the barn, reviewing the apology letter. "Do you think they mean it?" she asked. I shook my head. "They mean it right now because they're scared. But what matters is we have legal protection now. They can't touch us even if they want to." The State Attorney General's office moved quickly. Investigators arrived at Pine Valley Estates Management Office with subpoenas for all their development records. The sight of official vehicles parked outside their pristine clubhouse caused quite a stir among the residents. Bill Johnson watched the proceedings from his front porch with satisfaction. 30 years of pushing people around, thinking their money made them untouchable. About time somebody pushed back. But the most satisfying moment came when several Pine Valley residents actually approached us about joining our veteran support programs. They'd been intrigued by what they'd heard at the hearing and wanted to help. One resident, a retired teacher, even offered to start a gardening education program for local schools. "Looks like we're breaking down more than just legal barriers," Sarah observed as we watched a Pine Valley resident helping Tom with the new greenhouse construction. The media coverage was extensive. Local news stations ran features about our victory, focusing on the veteran rehabilitation aspects of our farm. Several national farming magazines reached out for interviews about standing up to development pressure. Our story was becoming a symbol of hope for small farmers everywhere. Rachel helped us leverage the attention to strengthen our position further. We applied for and received official designation as a veteran rehabilitation facility, which came with additional legal protections and grant opportunities. The County Agricultural Board fast-tracked our applications for expansion permits, impressed by our community support programs. The transformation in our daily operations was immediate. Without the constant harassment and legal threats hanging over us, we could focus entirely on growing our programs. More veterans joined our therapy sessions, drawn by the publicity and the promise of a safe, supportive environment. Our farm stand business boomed as people from all over the county came to show their support. Many stayed to learn about our mission and ended up becoming regular customers. Local restaurants that had been hesitant to work with us, fearing HOA retaliation, now eagerly sought our produce. Even the physical atmosphere seemed to change. Without HOA security vehicles constantly circling our property, the farm felt more peaceful. The veterans in our program reported feeling more relaxed, more able to focus on their healing journey. One morning, about a week after the hearing, I found an envelope in our mailbox. Inside was a check for the full amount of damages awarded, along with a personal note from the new interim HOA president. We hope this begins to make amends for our organization's past behavior. Your farm is an asset to our broader community, and we look forward to being better neighbors. Sarah and I decided to use the money to expand our veteran programs. We broke ground on a new therapy garden, complete with accessible raised beds for disabled veterans. The design included a meditation space where participants could find quiet reflection among the herbs and flowers. As I watched our community come together to help with the construction, veterans working alongside Pine Valley residents, farmers, teaching city folks about soil preparation, I realized we'd achieved something even more valuable than our legal victory. We'd shown that when people stand together against injustice, real change is possible. Marcus Wellington III's perfect suburban vision had crumbled, replaced by something more authentic. A genuine community where people from different backgrounds could work together and help each other heal. The moment of delivering our victory to Marcus Wellington III's doorstep was something I'd imagined many times, but the reality proved even more satisfying. 2 weeks after the hearing, I drove to his house, official documentation in hand. Pine Valley's security didn't even try to stop me. They'd been remarkably scarce since the hearing. I found Marcus in his immaculate front yard, supervising a landscaping crew. His face hardened when he saw me approaching, but there was something different in his expression, a hint of defeat that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Wellington," I called out, keeping my tone professionally neutral. "I thought you should have. Copies of the final paperwork." I held out the folder containing the hearing decision, the state AG's preliminary findings, and the official recognition of our farm as a protected veteran rehabilitation facility. He stared at the folder like it might bite him. "You could have mailed these," he said stiffly. "I could have," I agreed. "But after everything that's happened, I thought we should talk face to face, neighbor to neighbor." His landscapers had stopped working, watching our interaction with obvious interest. Marcus noticed and dismissed them with a wave. Once they were gone, his shoulders slumped slightly. "You know, Anderson, none of this was personal," he said, finally taking the folder. "It was just business. The development plans, the expansion, it would have brought jobs, tax revenue, progress." "Progress doesn't have to mean destroying what's already working," I replied. "Our farm, Bill Johnson's place, the other agricultural properties you've tried to push out, we're all part of this community too." He leafed through the papers, his frown deepening. The state investigation, it's going to destroy everything. My father built. Pine Valley Estates was supposed to be his legacy. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Maybe it's time for a different kind of legacy, I suggested. One that doesn't rely on bullying people off their land. He looked up sharply, but instead of his usual anger, there was something like curiosity in his expression. The veteran programs you run, they really help people. Come see for yourself, I offered, surprising both of us. We're having an open house next weekend. See what all this was really about. Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. I don't think I'd be very welcome. That's the thing about our community, I said. We believe in second chances. Ask any veteran, we all know about starting over. He was quiet for a long moment, looking past me toward our farm in the distance. The morning sun was just hitting our new greenhouse, making it gleam like a beacon. My grandfather was a veteran, he said suddenly. Korea, never talked about it much, but he had a garden, spent hours out there. I never understood why until he trailed off, then straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim some of his old authority. Well, Mr. Anderson, thank you for the documents. I'll have our lawyers review them. I nodded, turning to leave, but he called after me. That open house. What time did you say it was? I told him, then headed back to my truck. As I drove away, I saw him still standing there, the folder open in his hands, looking thoughtfully toward our farm. Sarah was waiting when I got back. How did it go? Better than expected, I replied, telling her about the conversation. He might actually come to the open house, she raised her eyebrows. Ready to welcome the enemy into camp? Not an enemy anymore, I said, watching our veterans working in the morning sun. Just another neighbor who might need some healing. The irony wasn't lost on us. The man who'd tried to destroy our therapeutic farm might end up benefiting from it himself. But then, that's what our mission had always been about, helping people heal no matter who they were. As we walked out to join our community in the fields, I couldn't help but smile at how things had turned out. Sometimes the best victory isn't just winning the battle. It's helping your former opponent find a better way forward. Marcus Wellington III had tried to build an exclusive community based on property values and artificial standards. Instead, he might just end up participating in a real community, one built on support, healing, and genuine connection to the land. The aftermath of our victory brought changes that rippled through the entire community. Pine Valley Estates underwent a complete transformation. The new HOA board, elected after the mass resignations, took a radically different approach to community relations. Instead of trying to control neighboring properties, they focused on building bridges. The most visible change came in the form of their new community outreach program. The interim president, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara Collins, approached us about collaboration opportunities. We've spent years building walls, she said during our first meeting. It's time to build connections instead. Our veteran therapy programs expanded beyond our wildest expectations. With the legal threats gone and new support flowing in, we could finally implement all the ideas we'd been holding back. The meditation garden, once just a dream, became a reality. We added specialized programs for disabled veterans, working with VA occupational therapists to design accessible gardening spaces. Even more surprisingly, several Pine Valley residents became regular volunteers, the same people who had once complained about our farm, now spent weekends helping with harvests or teaching gardening skills to newcomers. One resident, a former corporate executive turned master gardener, started a mentoring program pairing experienced gardeners with veterans learning to farm. Sarah found me one morning watching a group of Pine Valley kids helping our veterans plant fall vegetables. "Remember when they used to take pictures of our violations?" she asked, smiling. "Now they're taking pictures of their kids learning about farming. The state attorney general's investigation into Pine Valley's past practices continued, but with the old board gone and new leadership in place, the focus shifted to reform rather than punishment. The development plans for a luxury shopping complex were officially cancelled, replaced by a more modest proposal that respected existing agricultural properties. Bill Johnson, our elderly farmer neighbor, perhaps summed it up best. Ain't often you see folks admit they were wrong and actually try to do better. Usually they just dig in deeper. The local farmers market, which had once been a battleground between Pine Valley residents and local farmers, became a weekly celebration of community. Our farm stand was now just one of many where Pine Valley residents shopped regularly, chatting with farmers they'd once tried to drive away. Our success sparked interest from other communities facing similar challenges. Rachel found herself giving presentations to farmer advocacy groups about standing up to development pressure. Jenny's detailed documentation of our fight became a template for other small farmers dealing with HOA harassment. The media attention had an unexpected benefit. It attracted funding for veteran agricultural programs. Grants and private donations allowed us to expand our facilities and accept more participants. We added a commercial kitchen for processing produce and teaching cooking skills, and a classroom space for agricultural education programs. One morning, I arrived early to find a familiar Mercedes parked at our farm stand. Marcus Wellington III was examining our produce display, looking somewhat out of place in his business casual attire. "Fresh eggs," he said awkwardly when he saw me. My grandfather, he always said store-bought eggs couldn't compare to fresh ones. I helped him select a dozen eggs, along with some seasonal vegetables. As he paid, he cleared his throat. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about different kinds of legacies." He explained that he'd been meeting with the state AG's office, helping them understand Pine Valley's past practices so they could prevent similar situations elsewhere. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's a start." The transformation of our community wasn't just about changing policies or winning legal battles. It was about changing hearts and minds, showing people that prosperity doesn't have to come at the expense of community values. Our farm became a model for what was possible when people worked together instead of against each other. The veteran therapy programs, once seen as a nuisance by Pine Valley Estates, were now a source of community pride. Local schools regularly brought students for educational programs, and other communities sent representatives to learn from our experience. Sarah started a newsletter to keep everyone informed about farm activities and community events. The subscription list grew to include not just local residents, but people from all over the country interested in our story of community transformation. One evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset, a line of cars pulled into our driveway. It was a group of Pine Valley residents led by Barbara Collins. They carried dishes of food and folding chairs. "Hope you don't mind," Barbara called out. "We thought it might be nice to have a community dinner out here under the stars." As we helped set up tables and chairs, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. The battle for our farm had turned into something much more meaningful. A blueprint for how communities could heal their divisions and work together for a better future. Our farm flourished beyond anything we could have imagined during that first summer after our victory. The apple orchard, finally free from HOA interference, produced its first real crop since we'd restored it. The sight of those heritage varieties hanging heavy on the rejuvenated trees seemed like a perfect symbol of our triumph. The veteran programs expanded to include specialized tracks for different needs. We had intensive farming courses for those interested in starting their own agricultural operations, therapeutic gardening for those focusing on recovery, and part-time programs for veterans who just needed a peaceful place to spend a few hours. Each week, One particular success story stood out. James, a young Marine who'd struggled with severe PTSD, had started in our basic program just wanting somewhere quiet to be. Within months, he was managing our entire greenhouse operation. "The plants don't judge," he explained one day. "They just need care and patience, and they give it back tenfold." Our partnership with the reformed Pine Valley Estates led to unexpected innovations. Their expertise in organization and community management, once used to harass neighbors, now helped us streamline our operations and expand our reach. Barbara Collins, the new HOA president, proved particularly skilled at grant writing and fundraising. The chicken operation grew to include a training program for sustainable poultry farming. We added heritage breed conservation to our mission, working to preserve endangered varieties. The irony wasn't lost on us. The same HOA that had once complained about our chickens now proudly advertised their community's connection to agricultural preservation. Even Marcus Wellington III found his place in the new order. After helping the state AG's investigation, he started consulting with other communities facing similar development pressures, helping them find more sustainable solutions that preserved agricultural land while allowing for sensible growth. One morning, I found him in our orchard, studying the apple trees with unexpected interest. "My grandfather's garden," he said without preamble. "It had 3 apple trees. I remember helping him harvest when I was young, before we moved to the city. Before all this." He gestured vaguely at Pine Valley Estates. "It's not too late to plant some trees of your own," I suggested. He smiled slightly. "Maybe, though I think I've done enough damage to local agriculture for one lifetime." The farm stand evolved into a full-time market, offering not just our produce but products from other local farms. The building that had once been a point of contention with Pine Valley became a community hub, hosting educational programs and social events. Sarah's innovative idea to start a CSA, community-supported agriculture, program met with overwhelming success. Pine Valley residents, once our greatest opponents, became our most enthusiastic subscribers. The weekly vegetable boxes became a status symbol of sorts, but this time one based on supporting local agriculture rather than excluding it. Tom and Jenny's security concerns proved unnecessary. Instead of needing protection from harassment, we found ourselves hosting community events. The barn that we'd once fortified against potential vandalism became a gathering place for workshops, celebrations, and weekly community dinners. The therapy garden, completed with help from both veterans and Pine Valley volunteers, exceeded our greatest hopes. The serene space, with its accessible raised beds and quiet meditation areas, provided healing not just for veterans, but for anyone in the community needing peace. One special moment captured the transformation perfectly. During our fall harvest festival, I watched as James, our Marine-turned-greenhouse manager, taught a group of Pine Valley children about growing vegetables. Among them was Marcus Wellington III's nephew, eagerly asking questions about composting. "Never thought I'd see the day," Bill Johnson remarked, standing beside me. Wellington kids learning farming from a veteran on the land they tried to steal. The farm's success sparked a broader movement in the area. Other communities began reaching out, asking for advice on integrating agricultural spaces into suburban developments. Rachel found herself busy drafting guidelines for agriculture-friendly HOA policies. Our story became a case study in community transformation. Universities sent researchers to study how we turned conflict into cooperation. Agricultural programs asked us to host workshops on veteran rehabilitation through farming. The state AG's office used our experience to create new regulations protecting agricultural land from development pressure. But perhaps the most meaningful success was the quiet one, the daily sight of veterans finding peace in the fields, of neighbors working together instead of against each other, of a community healing its divisions through shared purpose and connection to the land. Sarah caught me one evening, standing at the edge of our property, looking out over the flourishing fields. "Penny for your thoughts, farmer," she said, slipping her arm through mine. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I replied, "from fighting for survival to building something that helps so many people." The sunset painted our fields gold. The restored barn stood proud against the darkening sky, and in the distance the lights of Pine Valley Estates twinkled like stars. Two communities, once at war, now part of something bigger than either could have been alone. Looking back now, 5 years after our battle with Pine Valley Estates, it's almost hard to believe how much has changed. Our little farm has grown into something we never could have imagined during those tense days of HOA harassment. The Veteran Rehabilitation Program has become a national model, with similar programs springing up across the country. We regularly host visitors from other states wanting to learn how to replicate our success. The V even created a special designation for therapeutic agricultural facilities based largely on our experience. The most rewarding part has been watching our veterans thrive. James, our Marine who started in the greenhouse, now runs his own organic farm 2 counties over. Jenny developed a specialized program teaching adaptive farming techniques to disabled veterans, which has been adopted by rehabilitation centers nationwide. Tom's carpentry workshops evolved into a full vocational training program. Pine Valley Estates transformed from our nemesis into our strongest ally. The community that once tried to fine us $50,000 for growing vegetables now takes pride in being known as a champion of sustainable agriculture. Their HOA guidelines, completely rewritten after the conflict, include specific provisions protecting and supporting local farming. Marcus Wellington III's transformation might be the most surprising. After helping the state AG's investigation, he threw himself into agricultural preservation. He now serves on the state's Farmland Conservation Board, using his business expertise to help protect small farms from development pressure. Last month, he even testified before the state legislature in favor of stronger protections for agricultural land. "Sometimes," he told me recently, "you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find what really matters." He's become a regular at our community dinners, often bringing his nephew, who dreams of becoming a farmer himself. The apple orchard that started all this trouble has become a local treasure. We identified 15 heritage varieties among the old trees, including 2 thought to be extinct. Agricultural colleges send students to study our preservation techniques, and our annual Apple Festival draws visitors from across the state. Sarah's CSA program expanded beyond our wildest dreams. We now supply fresh produce to over 300 families, with Pine Valley residents making up nearly half our membership. The waiting list grows longer every year, despite several other local farms starting similar programs. Our therapy garden has become a sanctuary not just for veterans, but for the entire community. Schools bring students for ecology lessons, mental health professionals refer patients for horticultural therapy, and even corporate groups come for team-building exercises in the garden. Bill Johnson, our elderly farmer neighbor who stood by us during the fight, passed away last year. His family honored his wishes by placing his land under a permanent agricultural conservation easement. He wanted to make sure, his daughter told us, that what you folks fought for would never be lost. The legal precedents from our case have helped protect other small farms facing similar pressure. Rachel still consults on cases across the country, using our experience to help others stand up to development harassment. The State Attorney General's guidelines for HOA oversight, drafted in response to our situation, have been adopted by several other states. Perhaps the most meaningful change has been in the daily life of our community. The artificial barriers between farm people and subdivision people have dissolved. Our barn hosts everything from wedding receptions to HOA meetings. Children from Pine Valley learn about agriculture alongside veterans finding healing in the fields. The farm stand that once sparked traffic complaints is now a beloved gathering place. Last week, we hosted our annual Harvest Festival. As I watched the sun set over our flourishing fields, I saw Marcus Wellington III teaching his nephew how to press apple cider, Jenny leading a workshop on adaptive gardening techniques, and Sarah organizing a group of Pine Valley volunteers for the fall planting. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Tom said, joining me at the fence. "All this from a fight over some vegetables and chickens. But it was more than that. Our battle with Pine Valley Estates wasn't just about farming rights or property values. It was about the kind of community we wanted to be. In trying to destroy our farm, they actually helped create something far more valuable. A genuine community where people from all backgrounds could come together, heal, and grow." As the festival wound down and people began heading home, I found Sarah by the bonfire. "Remember when we first bought this place?" she asked. "All we wanted was a quiet farm where you could find some peace after the service." I pulled her close, watching the flames dance. "We got something better. We got a mission." The lights of Pine Valley Estates sparkled in the distance, no longer a symbol of conflict but part of our extended community. The farm that they once tried to destroy had become the heart of something beautiful, a place where healing happens, where community thrives, and where the simple act of growing food brings people together. Sometimes the greatest victories come, not from defeating your enemies, but from turning them into friends. Our fight to save our farm ended up saving something much bigger, the soul of our community itself. That's worth more than any amount of HOA fines. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.